In the spring of 1922, 6 people vanished from a remote Bavarian farmstead, and nobody noticed for nearly a week. When neighbors finally came to check on the Gruber family, they found something that would horrify all of Germany and baffle investigators for over a century. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders, one of the most chilling and unsolved cold cases in European history, where the evidence pointed in every direction and nowhere at once, where the killer may have lived with his victims for days before striking, and where the truth has never fully come to light, where someone hid in the attic for days before slaughtering an entire family, and then stayed behind to feed the animals. Chapter 1: The Farm at the Edge of the World. The farm sat about 45 miles north of Munich, isolated and surrounded by dense Bavarian woodland, connected to the nearest village by a single dirt track that turned to mud every spring. Andreas Gruber lived there with his wife Cecilia, his widowed daughter Victoria, her 2 children young Cecilia and Joseph, and the family's newest maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had arrived only the day before the murders took place. Maria had replaced the previous maid, who had quit weeks earlier, claiming the farm gave her an overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling she could not explain but could not ignore. At the time, people in the village dismissed her as superstitious. Looking back, her instincts seem almost prophetic. The Gruber household was not a happy one even before the killings. Andreas was known throughout the surrounding villages as a harsh, secretive, and deeply unsociable man. He had been convicted of incest with his daughter Victoria years earlier, and the rumors about their relationship had never gone away. Victoria's young son Joseph was widely believed in the community to be Andreas's child, rather than the child of her deceased husband, and the shame and secrecy that surrounded that possibility had calcified into a wall between the Gruber family and the world outside their fence. They did not socialize. They did not invite visitors. The farm was a closed system with its own dark gravity. The weeks leading up to the murders had been strange even by the standards of that isolated household. Andreas confided to neighbors that he had discovered footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the forest toward the farmhouse, but crucially, no footprints leading back out again. He had heard what he described as footsteps in the attic on multiple nights, heavy and deliberate, moving in the darkness above the sleeping family. A newspaper had appeared in the house that nobody had purchased or could account for. A door to the farm's machine room had been found open on a morning when nobody had unlocked it. Each of these details, taken alone, might be explained away. Together, they describe something profoundly disturbing. Someone had been living on or near that property before the family died, watching them, learning their rhythms, waiting. Chapter 2: What the Neighbors Found. On the 2nd of April, 1922, a group of neighbors arrived at the farm to investigate the silence. No member of the Gruber family had been seen in days. The post had piled up uncollected. There had been no contact with the outside world. When the neighbors entered the property, the first thing they noticed was that the animals had been fed and the farm was in reasonable order. The second thing they noticed was the smell coming from the barn. Inside the barn, they found the bodies of Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia piled under a layer of straw. Inside the farmhouse, they found little Joseph in his cot and Maria Baumgartner in her room. All 6 had been killed with a mattock, a heavy farming tool similar to a pickaxe, and the violence of the attacks was described by those who processed the scene as unlike anything they had encountered. What made the discovery even more disturbing than the bodies themselves was the growing realization, as investigators examined the timeline, that someone had been living at the farm after the murders. The animals had been fed on multiple occasions. Smoke had risen from the chimney on days following the estimated time of death. A neighbor came forward to say he had sold cigarettes to someone from the farm after the night the killings were believed to have occurred. Whoever had killed 6 people had then stayed calmly in the house with the dead for several days before vanishing. The forensic examination of the scene was conducted using the methods of 1922, which is to say it was deeply limited. No reliable time of death could be established. No weapon was recovered. No fingerprints were taken in any meaningful way. The crime scene, by the standards of any modern investigation, was processed catastrophically. But even accounting for those limitations, investigators noted details that pointed toward a perpetrator with intimate knowledge of the property. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere. Nothing of significant value had been taken. The killings appeared targeted and purposeful, not the work of a random opportunist passing through. Chapter 3: 100 Suspects and No Answers. The investigation that followed was one of the most exhaustive in Bavarian history and also one of the most fruitless. Over the course of the following years, police interviewed more than 100 people with potential connections to the case. Former farmhands were tracked down and questioned. Traveling craftsmen who had worked at Hinterkaifeck were interviewed at length. Relatives, neighbors, and anyone who had a known grievance against Andreas Gruber were brought in and examined. The suspect list grew and grew, and the credible evidence against any single person on it remained stubbornly thin. One name stood out then and continues to stand out now. Lawrence Schlittenbauer was a local farmer who had been in a romantic relationship with Victoria and was considered by many to be the biological father of her son Joseph. He had a complex financial entanglement with the Gruber family and had been part of the group that discovered the bodies. Multiple witnesses noted that his behavior at the crime scene had been unusual, that he had moved around the barn touching things, that he had not seemed as shocked as the others, that he had looked at the bodies with an expression that people struggled to describe but found troubling. He had obvious motive in the sense that his relationship with the family was fraught, and his paternity of Joseph, if proven, would have had legal and financial implications. Investigators leaned toward Schlittenbauer at several points in the early investigation. But leaning toward someone and proving their guilt are entirely different things, and the evidence against him never rose above the level of suspicion. He was questioned repeatedly and never gave investigators the opening they needed. He died in 1941, having lived his entire remaining life under the cloud of unofficial suspicion without ever being formally charged. Now, before we go any further, if you are new here and you enjoy deep dives into true crime mysteries, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and make sure you hit the bell so you never miss a new upload. Now back to Hinterkaifeck. In the years following the initial investigation, the case was picked up periodically by new detectives and new theorists who believed they could find what earlier investigators had missed. One theory that gained traction proposed that the killer was a drifter or vagrant who had been using the farm's outbuildings as shelter and had committed the murders when he feared discovery. This would explain the presence in the attic and the mysterious newspaper, and it would explain why nothing of value was stolen, because theft had never been the motive. Another theory focused on the possibility of a connection to the wider political upheaval of the era. Germany, in 1922, was a deeply unstable country. The aftermath of the First World War had produced economic collapse, political extremism, and a general atmosphere of violence that touched even remote rural areas. Some researchers proposed that the Gruber family had a connection to one of the many paramilitary groups that were active in Bavaria at the time. This theory has never been developed into anything convincing, but it reflects how genuinely open the field of possible motives remains. Chapter 4. When Science Finally Looked Back. In 2007, students at a police academy in Munich took up the Hinterkaifeck case as an extended academic exercise, conducting a systematic review of all surviving documentation with modern investigative frameworks. Their conclusion, published after months of analysis, was that Lawrence Schlittenbauer remained the most credible suspect based on a combination of motive, opportunity, and behavioral evidence from the crime scene discovery. But they were also frank about the limits of their conclusion. Without physical evidence that could be forensically tested, certainty was impossible. Those limits were absolute. The farmhouse had been demolished in 1923, just 1 year after the murders, removing any possibility of future examination of the physical space. The skulls of the victims, which had been retained for analysis in the 1920s and were examined at one point by both forensic specialists and, humiliatingly, a clairvoyant, had disappeared during the chaos of the Second World War. They have never been found. The original case files were partially destroyed or lost in the same period. Every physical thread has been cut. The clairvoyant episode deserves a moment of attention because it illustrates how desperate investigators had become. At some point in the 1920s, the skulls of the Hinterkaifeck victims were presented to a psychic who was asked to use them to identify the killer. The psychic named a suspect, a local man who was then investigated and quickly cleared because he had a documented alibi. The fact that this was considered a reasonable investigative step tells you everything about where the case stood in terms of conventional evidence. The police had nothing, and they knew it. Chapter 5. The farm that is no longer there. Today, the clearing in the Bavarian countryside, where Hinterkaifeck once stood, is unmarked by any official memorial. The farm was torn down, the land was eventually absorbed into the surrounding forest, and nothing remains of the physical place where 6 people were killed, and their killer lived among their bodies in the spring of 1922. People come anyway. They find the location through historical records and online research, and they stand in the clearing and look at the trees and try to feel the shape of something that happened a century ago. The case has passed into German folklore in a way that few true crimes manage. It has been the subject of novels, a feature film, countless documentary treatments, and ongoing academic study. New theories appear regularly, each claiming to have found the angle that resolves the contradictions. None has produced anything approaching proof. What the Hinterkaifeck case ultimately offers, and why it continues to draw people in, is a near-perfect combination of horror and mystery. The horror is the image of a killer moving through that isolated farm in the cold April nights after the murders, feeding the animals, keeping the fire going, sleeping perhaps in the same house as the people he had just destroyed. The mystery is everything else: who he was, why he chose that family, why he stayed, and where he went. Those questions have no answers. The case is officially open and practically unsolvable. The killer walked in from the dark and walked back into it, and the dark kept his secret completely. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel. You can also watch more crime videos like this one by clicking on screen.